ISO 27001 Annex A 8.1 end user devices. So now we're making a move into Annex A 8. These are the technical controls that mitigate risks to support your information security management system. As we work through these technical controls, some of them we've already touched upon, some of them are going to be covered in other tutorials, but what I am going to do is I'm covering them again here and I'll make reference back to that. Some of the technical controls are going to be new to you, some of them are going to worry you, so we're going to take a look at how we can implement those new controls to give you maximum success. But we're starting here with Annex A 8.1 end user endpoint devices. End user endpoint devices. So what are we looking at? Let's have a little look at what the standard says, and then I'm going to show you how you can go about satisfying that. The definition: information stored on, processed by, or accessible via user endpoint devices should be protected. So this is a very simple, straightforward technical control requirement, right? We're looking at the mitigation of risks when it comes to endpoint devices. How can we mitigate the risks to confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data on those endpoint devices? So a couple of things, many of these we've gone through before. When we're looking at our implementation guide, we're going to look at a topic-specific policy. Now, I say topic-specific policy, actually, when we go through implementing via the toolkit, it makes common sense to group policies based on subjects, and therefore the technical control elements, the policy elements here, are actually going to be in other policies. So we're going to have malware policy, we're going to have encryption policy, we've got user access policy, we've got remote working policy. All of these policies are designed to cover and include endpoint devices. So we're going to draw on those. We're going to draw on those, and we're going to know what policies we've got, what controls we've got, and where they are and how they link together. Clearly, when it comes to the endpoint devices, a lot of these are around technical controls. Okay, so it is the case that you may not have a particular technical control, and that's fine. Just understand why you haven't got it, manage it through risk if it's appropriate, have it on your risk register if it's appropriate, and accept the risk of not having it. But common technical controls that we're going to have here specifically relating to endpoint devices include having anti-malware. So we're going to have an anti-malware policy, and then we're going to have technical controls on our devices where feasible and where possible. We're going to have that anti-malware software that's running and protecting us from threats, from known threats and threats that are emerging. So we're going to place heavy reliance here on having an anti-malware technical control in place. We cover that. That is a control in its own right. We will come to that. So this is a little bit of a catch-all. We're going to have endpoint encryption where possible and where feasible. So we're going to encrypt those endpoint devices, so that if that device is compromised, the data that's held upon it can only be accessed by the right individual. We're going to put some access control on there. Absolutely, we're going to do that in line with our access control policy. And again, we're going to come onto some technical controls around access. But we're going to make sure that we've got the right level of access to that. And then we've got a couple of other considerations that we can put in. Here we can think about backups of endpoints, so the protection of the device from a backup perspective. And as a rule, for ease, we're not going to have a structured approach to backing up of endpoint devices. Bearing in mind that the bulk of you that are watching this are smaller organizations, you know, we're going for the bulk, for the majority approach here. And putting in backup of endpoint devices isn't necessarily something we're going to do. We've covered that. We've done a tutorial on backup, and where we touched upon why and how and the variations and the exceptions to that. So please check out that policy. But just to know that this can be a real rabbit hole that we can go down if we start to get into backups. What we are going to do is we're going to educate. So we've done tutorials on education, and we've done education tutorials on training. So we're going to place a huge emphasis here on education of users of endpoint devices so that they understand what it is that they need to do, what the risks are associated with that, and how they can mitigate those risks. So go back through the training module, the education module, the communication module about how we do that. But education is going to play a big part. What we're also going to look at here is bring your own devices. Now, it isn't my recommendation that you allow bring your own devices and that you allow personal devices into your environment. Again, I sound like repetition. We have covered this as part of asset management. If we do allow bring your own devices, please check out the tutorial on asset management. There are certain considerations that we have in place. You're going to ask me the question, do personal devices go on our asset register? And the guidance that I gave you previously is yes, they do. We put those devices on the asset register because there are things that we might want to put in place around restricting access to our environment based on endpoint, IP addresses, or other technical controls that are in there, and there are assurances that we want around those bring your own devices. So have a little look around that. The pitfalls, the caveats that are within that, obviously legislation works against you. If you allow bring your own device, you allow personal devices, there is a huge amount of law, depending on your jurisdiction and locale and where you're located in the world, that's going to come into play here that may prevent you from doing things that you think that you can do. Okay, so they're a lot harder to control. They're easier in terms of you working and thinking, oh, it's great, just let everybody bring their own device. But from an information security point of view, they represent a significant risk. We have covered bring your own device. Check out those tutorials and to understand a little bit more around that. What we need to do here is to pass the audit, we've got to have policies and procedures in place, right? We've got to understand what our endpoints are. We've got to understand whether or not you're going to put in configuration standards about how you configure those, how you remove ports that are not needed and services that are not needed. We're going to have to put in place all of that documentation around the management of that endpoint device. We're going to assess our equipment and we're going to perform a risk assessment. That would have been included as part of our asset management. When we went through asset management, we covered about how we assess the asset and how we associate the risk with it and the level of classification. To pass the audit, we're going to have records, right? We're going to have records about how we're changing, how we're updating on top of the asset management records that we've got. And we're going to have tests in place around those controls that forms part of your internal audit and your checking and your monitoring in the tutorials that we covered on that. So you can see, as we've touched on a number of times, the controls that we have oftentimes are just either a recap or adding a little bit more information around a specific topic, and therefore they're not necessarily additional work. The work for you is to understand what is it that this particular Annex A control is asking for, and then with all of the things that you've done already, can you evidence that? Can you draw down on that? Can you answer the questions that are associated with that? So the audit is going to check that you've got that asset registered. They're going to make sure that every endpoint device is on there. They're going to make sure that that device is protected and it's checked and it's controlled. And what they will do, pretty much anybody that they audit when it comes to certification audit will be fair game to do an audit of their endpoint device. So things that we say here, and I give you that when we talk about preparing for the external audit, is make sure that the devices of everybody that is going to be audited are fully up to date for antivirus, fully up to date for patching, fully up to date for encryption and are encrypted, that they're completely cleaned down of anything, you're going through junk and trash folders and making sure that everything's removed, that the desk is clear on that device, that the malware that is installed on there, any alerts that are showing on that device that you can reference, that you've managed them. So there's a lot of health check that you want to do pre-certification audit. Of course you're going to be doing these anyway, right? Of course you're going to be doing these anyway. So there's nothing in here that should catch you out, but just know that it is often the case that come the audit, the night before the audit, a new patch was released and you haven't applied it. There was a new antivirus control that dropped and you haven't applied it, or some notification has gone off, or some user has done something. You want to do your housekeeping of that endpoint before that external audit. Mistakes that people make, letting people use their own devices, it isn't, a massive mistake per se, but there are a lot of challenges that come with that, and we've touched upon those. So if you are doing that, make sure that you've covered off those points that we've raised previously, and you should be golden. But I would strongly discourage you from doing it. Even if you're a small organization, a couple of employees, even one employee, having organization owned assets that are controlled by the organization is absolutely the way to go. Another mistake that we see is not encrypting devices. Again, smaller organizations, early stage organizations, not putting in place encryption. If you have a device and you can't encrypt it for whatever reason, for whatever technical reason, then that is an exception and it is going to go onto your risk register. You're going to put in the mitigating controls that go alongside that. You're going to manage it as I've shown you before. and you're going to accept the risk, so that for that particular device or device type, you are managing the risk of not being able to either encrypt it or have antivirus on it or patch it or whatever it may be. So a little bit of a recap there for us on a number of additional controls. 8.1, straightforward. A lot of this we've already covered. You're working within, either IT, you come from a technical background. If you don't, you have people that do. Make sure that you're protecting those endpoint devices. There are tools out there that bring additional controls that you can consider. EDM, endpoint device management tools. If that's the way that you want to go, then I would strongly encourage you to do that. These are technologies and tools that allow you to enforce certain things on those endpoint devices. It may be the case that you're using things like the equivalent of an Active Directory and you're centrally managing and you're able to centrally control those endpoint devices. Again, I would encourage you to do that. Engage with your technical teams to understand a little bit more around that. So there are things that we can do here around endpoint device management, and there are additional controls that we will come to about things like remote wipe, remote disabling, etc., that come as a benefit for some of these EDM directory-based tools that you can deploy. You'll have to just evidence to the auditor, you know what your devices are, you know what the risks associated with devices are, and you're controlling the risks, and you're going to be absolutely golden. My name is Stuart Barker. I am the ISO 27001 Ninja. I remain the Ninja as we work our way now through Annex A 8, the technical controls. Quite a lot of these to go at, so stick with me as we work through them, and until the next tutorial, peace out.